This site contained artifacts of earlier cultures, but artifacts from latter periods are absent. Pottery making and agriculture were introduced from Mexico between 500 BC and 1500 AD, changing the Indian lifestyle profoundly. The hunter-gatherer nomadic life became one centered on crops, seasonal camps, and semi-permanent villages. Maravillas Creek also created the first rapid of the lower canyons. Maravillas Creek Rapid, rated Class 1 to 2, occurs at the junction of the creek and the Rio Grande. Watch for the large rock in the pillow on the right side. Large standing waves and cross currents at high water make the rapid more difficult. Maravillas Creek Rapid was also the final straw for Tyler W. Chandler on November 3, 1852. With an escort under the command of Army Lieutenant Duff Green, Chandler stood in the area of Maravillas Creek and decided to give up on their mission to survey the river that formed the boundary between the United States and Mexico. Practically barefoot, Chandler and his men chose to walk across the Mexican desert to Eagle Pass, Texas, rather than continue downstream through the lower canyons. 4 centuries after the Spanish first went to the Big Bend, over 1/5 of the river's course went unscribed. With exception of a few Indians that once lived in cliffside caves, the secret riverland that lay between the entrance of the Rio Conchas into the Rio Grande and the confluence of the Pecos remained a great mystery. After Chandler's failure in 1852, Lieutenant Nathaniel Mitchler had planned to float the river from Reagan Canyon to the confluence of the Pecos. However, he found the terrain so rugged that he chose to detour around the lower canyons, occasionally approaching the cliffs to look down upon the river. He finally put his boats in the water 54 miles downstream at a common Indian ford now called Dryden Crossing. Toward the end of the 19th century, the boundary survey of the Rio Grande was somewhat incomplete because the river had not been surveyed totally by boats. It was not until 1899 that the last secrets of the lower canyons were penetrated and recorded. In the autumn of that year, Robert T. Hill, an officer of the United States Geological Survey, set out to fully explore and describe the canyons of the Rio Grande from Presidio to Lane Tree. The sunshine in the open stretches was pitiless. More than once they had to drag the boats around dangerous rapids. Along the river's course, other dangers were present, and because of these they kept their loaded rifles beside their oars. Every bush and stone was closely watched for possible ambush from bandits and Indians. Finally, after rowing for at least 10 hours a day for over a month, the Hill expedition arrived at Lane Tree. His report and photographs are the first record of the lower canyons. However, the publication of his findings did not excite much enthusiasm. Most people preferred to believe in the legends of a 7,000-foot chasm, similar to those of the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River. For years it was believed that the boundary surveys of the 1800s were inaccurate. In reality, the recordings of canyons less than 2,000 foot deep were fairly accurate measurements. Hill's report eventually faded into obscurity, only to be revived 30 years later by R.M. Wagstaff, a state legislator who became interested in the canyons of the Big Bend. His efforts eventually led to the creation of the Texas Canyon State Park, which would eventually become Big Bend National Park. Between Maravillas Creek and Big Canyon is Las Vegas de los Ladrones, or Outlaw Pass. Here the river usually runs slow and easy. It is a time to relax and enjoy the anticipation of the deep canyons and the rapids ahead. A prominent landmark in this area is Cerro El Sombrero. It is also referred to as Castle Butte or Ship Hill. Robert Hill identified and named this butte during the expedition in 1899. In this area, the river tends to be broad and shallow. Mischievous sandbars frequently appear, dividing the river into multiple channels, and it can become quite a nuisance, especially if one chooses the wrong route around them. 20 miles downstream from La Linda, the lowlands began to cease as Big Canyon enters from the Texas side of the river. Upstream from the mouth of the canyon, the ruins of a rock house and Candelilla waxworks overlook the Rio Grande just before it turns to the northeast. Across the river, the long range of high ridges and cliffs are called the Cerrito de Guadalupe. Over 3,400 feet high, they herald the approach of the deeper canyons that lie ahead. Big Canyon Rapid is the second rated rapid downstream from La Linda. Rated a Class 2, it is best run at left center due to the rocks in the channel. There are large standing waves at high water, but they can be skirted along the left eddy line. At water levels above 5 feet, the rapid itself is almost non-existent. A short distance ahead lies one of the most fascinating canyons in legend and story of the Big Bend country. Reagan Canyon, named after the four Reagan brothers, John, Jim, Frank, and Lee, intersects the river from Texas. Around 1883, the Reagans were ranching in this area. A Seminole by the name of Bill Kelly worked for them as a ranch hand. One day they sent Bill across the river into Mexico to locate and retrieve some runaway horses. Bill didn't find the horses, but he did find a chunk of gold ore. Upon returning to the ranch, Lee Reagan asked Kelly if he had spotted the missing pony. Bill shook his head and, with a grin, pulled out the lump of ore. Reagan, for whom at the time considered most rocks as an obstacle from growing feed, could not have distinguished between gold ore and petrified wood, and was sure that his employee knew even less. And so, far from sharing Kelly's excitement over the rock, he was merely irritated that he had not found the horse. Kelly hung on to the ore, and several days later, he left the Reagans and, with a trainload of cattle, went to Mexico City. During this time, Bill became acquainted with the train conductor, Mr. Locke Campbell. And as payment for his fare, Bill gave him a small portion of his gold. Campbell took the gold ore and had it assayed. The result of the assay was amazing, for Bill's gold ore was worth $80,000 per ton. About this time, Bill Kelly disappeared. Locke Campbell searched for the gold mine and for Bill Kelly, never finding either. The Reagans spent a fortune looking for the mine. Even today, the search continues for that mine. Other remnants of the past are still evident in this section of the Big Bend. 9 miles downstream from Reagan Canyon is a set of ruins called the Asa Jones Waterworks. Jones, by a series of pumps, raised water by gravity and distributed it over much of the western portion of his Bullis Gap Ranch. Later, he developed the Candelilla wax operation at the same location. The Candelilla plant grows throughout the Chihuahuan Desert of northern Mexico and the Big Bend region of Texas. Migrant camps harvest the plant and render it to produce raw wax. Since the plant cannot be cultivated, the need to harvest one area and then move on to another creates the migratory nature of the business. Being in proximity to the river was necessary because the processing of the plant requires large amounts of water. The freshly harvested candelilla plants are prepared by boiling them in a vat with a dilute solution of sulfuric acid until the wax foams at the top of the boiling water. It is then skimmed off and poured into a mold to harden overnight. The hardened wax is then broken into small pieces and packed in old mesh bags. It takes approximately 10,000 pounds of fresh candelilla plant to produce 240 pounds of raw wax. Obviously, the depletion of the plant in one area can occur very quickly. That is the primary reason why the wax industry is in decline along the river today.